Welcome everybody to the presentation of DMM's Q3 report on market issues and performance. This call, as you heard, I think, when you logged in today, is being recorded. Calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meeting. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. So, on that note, I'm happy to start the presentation today. As always, we really welcome all of your questions during the presentation. It's the discussion that makes these fun to do. To ask a question, and we encourage that, please do use the raise hand feature in WebEx. I'll stop periodically through the presentation anyway, or use if you called in by telephone only, use the #2 feature, and that should let you ask a question. Our report was published last week and is available on the DMM website. There's a link to it at the bottom right here. The material in this presentation comes from that report and also from our recent board memo, and so I added a link to that as well. As always, the material presented here is the hard work of a lot of analysts in DMM, and due credit goes to them. The stakes are mine, and the material presented today is really the tip of a vast iceberg of material that is available to you on both on DMM's website and on the ISO's website. I'd particularly like to point out a set of ISO monthly reports covering the summer months of 2021, June, July, August, and September, that are posted and available if you would like to delve deeper into any subject. And with that, I can advance my slide. Highlights of Q3 2021. There were higher prices both in the ISO and actually across the EIM compared to Q3 of 2020. Some of the big factors behind that were lower hydroelectric generation within the ISO, higher gas prices, both at the hubs within the ISO and across the EIM footprint, and higher outage rates, particularly within the ISO. We also have a number of special issues that we covered in this report, new market rules that were implemented in Q3 leading up to the summer, wheels, so that's power that is being transferred through the ISO footprint, and ISO exports, so exports from the ISO, as well as resource adequacy performance and backstop capacity procurement. The big issue within the Western energy imbalance market continues to be the EIM Resource Efficiency test. Highlight here that DMM has taken on an expanded role in monitoring and reporting on performance and issues with these EIM Resource Efficiency tests. There are both reports and data for July through October available on DMM's website, and that link is below. We are hoping to publish today, actually, the report covering the month of October, as well as the data behind that report. The reason for the focus on the EIM Resource Efficiency test is that test failure can have a significant impact on market results, particularly on prices. The other major change highlighted in the report is on EIM transfers, particularly midday transfers. We saw a change in those. This is the last sort of summary, a little bit of housekeeping before I get into the market results. There were settlement timeline changes that were implemented effective in January of this year. those settlement timeline changes continue to affect our reporting because they affect the timeliness of settlement data availability. We rely on settlement data for our metrics on all kinds of things, but particularly on load, wholesale energy cost calculation, as well as some of our metrics on particular parts of settlement, including particularly offset costs. The new timelines mean that the final settlement data is really available about a quarter after the effective date in the market. So those are delayed, but we do continue to monitor, and some of those are included in the report today. This is the first year under this new timeline. We're still getting a sense for how much the initial data is changing from the final settlement data. Just to give you a ballpark idea, Q2 offset costs changed in about a 2-month period. The estimate from the settlement data changed from about $12 million to about $25 million in one category. So we are seeing some major changes. Okay. ISO prices increased significantly compared to Q3 of last year. This is our average monthly price chart. Day-ahead prices are shown in blue, 15-minute prices shown in yellow, and the 5-minute prices are shown in green. On average, our day-ahead price for the third quarter was $65 per megawatt hour, up from $47 last year. $63 for the 15-minute market, up from $44 last year, and $58 for the RTE, up from $36 last year. So very significant change. You can also see that the gap between the day-ahead, although day-ahead prices are above the 15-minute and real-time market price, but the gap between those is fairly small. Most of this increase, I think, can be explained by increases in the underlying gas cost. Gas units do tend to be on the margin in our market, and gas units in the South, for example, can set prices across the ISO system. More broadly, we've seen increases in gas prices across the EIM footprint. The Q3 averages by hub are compared in the table in the upper left-hand corner. You can see that most more than doubled. The exception to that is PG&E, where there was a significant increase, but it fell short of actually doubling. The Henry Hub, which is shown in the dark blue, is the national index used as a comparative measure. Finally, this is one of my favorite charts that DMM has produced recently. This is a chart that shows average monthly prices in the day-ahead 15-minute and 5-minute market compared to the SoCal Citygate gas price shown on the right-hand side. The left-hand side is showing our average wholesale electricity prices. Right-hand side is showing the average hub gas prices in dollars per MMBTU. And you can see there that the gas price last year this is set so that it reflects the marginal production cost for a relatively efficient gas resource. That the increase we're seeing in the electricity cost this year relative to the increase in gas costs is low. So the average average costs, although higher, are still lower than would be predicted based on the increase in gas prices alone. One of the other trends that we've seen starting to develop really over the last few years is an increase in bilateral market prices in other balancing areas. That was true in this summer, over this summer period as well. We've had higher, this chart is showing average monthly peak prices at Pacific Gas and Electric in Southern California, Edison in the dashed lines, and at two of the major hubs in the West, Mid-Columbia and Palo Verde, in yellow and blue. As you can see in the chart, we have started to see months in which the average prices, and this is true on a smaller time scale as well, were higher at Palo Verde and Mid-Columbia. This is reflecting market conditions in those areas. Higher demand and some retirements and other underlying supply conditions there. Although we did see periods of extraordinarily high demand, and I'll just point out that in late June and in July there were periods of very high demand across the western United States. And although we did see those periods, our peak load in the ISO peak load was lower than, at least as currently estimated, and again, I'm waiting on the final numbers to get published, was lower than any peak load value we've seen over the last 10-year period. This chart is showing the 1 and 2 year peak forecast, so that's the median peak forecast used in planning, the 1 and 10 year peak forecast used in ISO planning in green, compared to the actual peak in blue. I'll pause here for any questions. Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand feature or put a question in the chat. Fortunately, one of the downsides of presenting is that I can't see those, but they will interrupt me. Jennifer?
I do have a question from Ian. If you can please unmute Ian's line.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, and if you would please introduce yourself.
Sure, yes. Ian White with Shell Energy.
Thank you.
My question is, I think one slide back, maybe 2 slides, when comparing prices with other regions. Yeah, thank you. It wasn't clear to me from the slide and from your commentary, are we comparing day-ahead to day-ahead prices, or are we comparing some other combination?
Yes, these are day-ahead prices compared to day-ahead prices over the peak package period hours. The report, again, the slides here are just the tip of the big iceberg. The report also has a comparison based on the PowerDex data that we use in monitoring that compares which is more of a real-time bilateral index.
Yeah, great. That's helpful. Thank you. That was my question.
Sure. You're very welcome. All right. Moving on. This chart is showing our average hourly generation by fuel type in Q3. A couple of things I'll point out on this chart. One is our total renewable production, and that is not renewable by the stricter definitions used by the ISO. That is including all hydro, solar, and wind, as well as biofuels production. Total renewable production was down by about 1%, mostly due to a 29% reduction in hydro. Wind generation increased relative to Q3 of 2020 by 11%, and solar increased by 10%. Overall, we saw natural gas generation increasing by 8%, and that's really compensating for a decrease in imports as well as the decrease in hydro generation. The other thing I'll point out on this chart is at the very bottom you see a sort of an orange for other. That other does include storage resources. We did see a market increase in storage resources on the ISO system. That is anticipated to grow to about 2,500 megawatts by the end of this year. These are our stats for hydroelectric generation by month. What we're showing are averages by year, including 2015. 2015 was a record low year for hydro generation in the ISO. And what we have seen thus far for ISO hydro production in 2021 is that it's very close on average to what was generated back in 2015. Very low hydro. And yeah, and overall, apologies, I need to update this is my slide from Q2. Apologies. Yeah, overall renewable generation was down 1%, and the hydro generation was down 29%, continuing the trend from Q2. Average hourly interchange decreased in all hours of the quarter. This is showing monthly average imports and exports and net interchange. This is from our board memo. The dotted lines are showing the net before EIM, and the solid gray is showing the net interchange after EIM by month. There's a quarterly version in the quarterly report. Overall, what we saw was really a decrease in imports in both the day-ahead and 15-minute market, shown in blue and yellow. Fairly static exports on average. One of the big changes that we've seen in import bidding is in the bidding of resource adequacy imports. There was a change in the requirements for resource adequacy import bids that went into place in January of 2021. That change required RA imports to bid in at or below zero, and we do continue to see that, as has been true in prior months, that most resource adequacy imports are bidding in at or below $0. Some of those bidding in above that value are non-CPUC jurisdictional entities, which don't have to abide by that CPUC requirement. Others are not. I'll leave it at that. Other than to note that overall there's been a lower volume of resource adequacy imports. These are showing average bids in the availability assessment hours of the day, on average by a month. One of the other trends is an increase in outages. This has also been true relative to some of the prior years. What we see is an increase particularly in the planned outages. So comparing this yellow and green value to last year and the year prior. when we look at that on a fuel type basis, we see that that's made up of increases across the board in gas outages, hydro, as well as notably some of the other outage type here shown in red. There are more other resources than there had been, so there are also more other outages. The counterweighing factor in terms of the competitiveness of the market is that despite higher outage rates and lower hydro generation, both of which we would expect to reduce the supply available, especially the low-cost supply available in the market, we did see a more structurally competitive Q3 than we did in Q3 of 2020. This chart is showing the number of hours in which the residual supply index is less than 1 by quarter, going back to 2016. This is the residual supply index takes on a system level in the day-ahead market all the supply available relative to a measure of total demand. It then takes out the first biggest or two biggest or three biggest pivotal suppliers and calculates that ratio. When that ratio is less than 1, we're counting that hour on this chart. So we continue to see that average prices are very affected by our net load. The red dashed line here is showing the net load, that's the real-time market requirement for this chart, minus utility scale wind and solar. So that obviously excludes all of the rooftop solar and other non-utility scale generation. What we see is that our day-ahead prices, which is where most of the settlement is in our market, track our average net load very, very closely. We are indeed seeing lower day-ahead prices in the middle of the day when solar generation peaks than we are at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, when you would see that more traditional. One of the other factors that is a trend that we've been tracking now for several years is the increase in imbalance conformance adjustments, sometimes called load bias in the ISO market. This chart is showing average imbalance conformance in the hour-ahead market in red, 15-minute market in green, and the 5-minute market in blue, for 2021 in the solid lines and for 2020 in the dotted lines. The increase in these values began in 2017 and has been increasing since that time. We do see changes in patterns in the early morning hours, but the peak imbalance conformance has been increasing fairly steadily. I tend to get a lot of questions on this. I'm happy to take them. I would suggest that if you are interested in seeing, for instance, the distribution of imbalance conformance, we do have some really nice additional material available in our monthly EIM Resource Efficiency reports. So if you would like to see, for example, the box whisker version of this, even on a monthly basis, that is available, both from DMM, and I think the ISO has published one of those as well. So follow up on the discussion of imbalance conformance. Something that is highlighted often is that as the ISO has yet to implement the nodal pricing for flexible ramping product. There's an expectation that when that is implemented, which should be, I think is currently scheduled in the fall of 2022, that the flexible ramping product would be able to more effectively meet ramping conditions in real time, and we might see less demand from operators to rely on imbalance conformance. A few notes on that. DMM has a long-standing recommendation that the ISO develop a product, a market product that really does address the longer-term demand for ramping that you can see in the ISO operator imbalance conformance. This chart, we continue to see zero prices for flexible ramping product in almost all intervals. This chart is showing the frequency of non-zero prices in the system or in the ISO. Just a few fast notes on this. The ISO implemented an interim measure prior to the nodal pricing changes that are coming for flexible ramping product back in November. That measure is applying a system level constraint, minimum constraint under certain conditions. And once that was added in the 15-minute market, we did start to see more frequent positive non-zero prices for the ISO. That minimum requirement is binding frequently for the ISO, but not very frequently for any other area in the energy imbalance market system. I will just highlight thank you actually to, I think, a member of the audience, although I can't tell who's online. As noted by Dan Williams on the recent MPPF call hosted by the ISO, DMM has been reporting that there was a change on the supply side for the flexible ramping product in terms of the resource set that would qualify to provide that service. And following that change, which occurred in May, we've seen a lower frequency of positive flexible ramping product prices in the ISO. Essentially a change that would allow wind and solar generation to supply flexible ramping product. So thank you. We do encourage market participants and those interested in the market to ask these questions directly of the ISO. It's very helpful. So thank you, Dan, for doing that. Okay. I'll move on. We did see less congestion in Q3 within the ISO relative to Q3 of 2020. This chart is showing the average impact to day-ahead prices in ISO DLAP. What we can see for Q3 is that we see the typical pattern where internal congestion is leading to relative increases in the south, SCE and San Diego Gas and Electric, and decreasing prices in the north, but to a much lesser extent than had been the case in Q3 of 2020. Overall, day-ahead congestion was down to 166 million relative to 220 million back in Q3 of 2020. One of the other measures that DMM has been tracking are losses in the congestion revenue rights auction. So as a reminder, that's an auction that gives the rights holder the right to collect the price difference in the day-ahead market between two nodes. There were changes that were implemented back in the applying here starting in 2019, restricting the nodes that were available in the node pairs that were available in that auction, and also restricting payouts on any pair of nodes to the total congestion rent collected on those nodes. That's CRR truck 1A and 1B. Overall, in the third quarter, we see losses that are estimated, and again, we're dealing with the settlement timeline changes, but estimated to be about $10 million less than payments made to non-load serving entities. So about 6% of day-ahead congestion rent. And that is, again, well below average losses in 2016 to 2018, which were about 28% of congestion rent. DMM continues to recommend that the CRR auction be replaced by a platform allowing the transactions between willing buyers and sellers. And before I switch over to the EIM, I want to highlight one of the, I think, one of the areas I would encourage the most market participant attention. We saw real-time offset costs in Q3 that are currently estimated to be about $72 million in Q3 alone. That's about 140% of total ancillary services cost, which were $51 million, and multiple, almost between 2 and 3 times total bid cost recovery payment costs. Costs for the first 3 quarters of the year in total are about $156 million. I realized my legend got cut off increasing this, but the blue is real-time imbalance energy costs, and the green is the real-time congestion imbalance offset costs. We continue to see congestion offset costs, and again, there was much less congestion overall, but we continue to see congestion offset costs that are associated with constraint changes between the day-ahead and real-time market. I'd suggest if you're interested, reviewing the 2018 Q3 report has a very nice in-depth explanation of how those constraint changes can lead to congestion offsets. My other request or recommendation is that those that are impacted by these costs, and they are uplift to measured demand, do review your settlement statements when those more final settlement statements are available at the T+70B, and please do submit a city ticket or otherwise ask the ISO if you would like more information on the generation of these offset costs. With that, I will switch gears to the energy imbalance market unless there are any questions on the phone. Ancillary service costs were actually down substantially from the year before. So year before Q3, those were about $97 million altogether. That had to do with lower requirements. The chart that you see on the screen is showing average EIM hourly transfers in the 15-minute market for the California ISO. You can see the big change here is happening, although it's an increase in imports below the x-axis in all hours relative to the previous Q3. The biggest change is really coming in the middle of the day when that solar generation peak is in place. That solar generation had been generally exported through the energy imbalance market, and that was although that's still happening to some degree, on net, the ISO was a net importer in almost all hours. That is the report contains similar figures for other areas. So if you're interested in seeing overall how the flow is changing, you can put the pieces together with the figures in the report. But what we do see really is that as the ISO is exporting less in the middle of the day, other areas are then importing less, and so their net imports are going down, particularly Pacificor and some of the areas in the Southwest. When we're looking at prices over this sort of longer term, what we really see here, as we did when we were looking at some of the first slides on ISO prices, is that the change in gas prices is increasing prices really across the EIM. We're seeing higher average prices in the 15-minute market. To get to Ian's question earlier, these are 15-minute market real-time average prices for EIM areas, and we're seeing those on average being highest in the Northern California areas, of which there are several at this point. This is another way of breaking down prices that we've started to publish in the reports. This is another one of my favorite charts that I didn't come up with. The line here is showing our average price, and again, these are 15-minute market prices. That is where most of the settlement in the energy imbalance market occurs. And that line is the sum of the component pieces. The blue is showing the system-wide energy price. In the 15-minute market, that really makes up the bulk of the price in all areas, shown in blue, and that is the same value across the system. As we didn't have any new areas joining in Q3. To that are added transmission losses in black, congestion within the California ISO shown in yellow, a greenhouse gas, and actually that's congestion within any of the energy imbalance market areas as well. There's very little of that. Greenhouse gas component shown in green, that is a reduction in areas outside of the state of California. And that reduction in greenhouse gas is then paid back to those areas as a way of making any resources whole for their greenhouse gas cap and trade California state obligation. And then in red, we are showing congestion on EIM transfer limits. So that's congestion between areas within the energy imbalance market. That congestion rent is then paid back to the entities that made that transmission available within the energy imbalance market. So between most regions, that's split 50-50 between the two regions. In some cases, that is paid only to one side or the other, but that spread is then paid back also. Overall, what we're seeing, as we did in the other chart, is that the prices are really higher in the Northern California areas across the board. And then we do see, as we have for quite an extended period of time, that there are lower prices, tend to be in the far northwest. Those regions do tend to be separated by congestion during the peak hours of the day. This is another way to look at the same hourly 15-minute prices. And here what we see is that the prices in Salt River project are really highest across the board in these hour ending 19 and 20, in those peak net load hours of the day. One of the ways we look at that is doing the same kind of price decomposition we do across the different areas. And here what you can see is that it's that area level congestion, that congestion on EIM transfer constraints, that is really increasing the prices in Salt River project in those peak hours of the day. That is one of the reasons I'm highlighting that is because that can be, it's not always, but it can be the result of EIM resource efficiency test failures. The impact of failing, the consequence of failing one of the EIM resource efficiency tests is that transfers are capped. And capping those transfers can then lead to congestion on those constraints, which can in turn lead to higher prices in the upward direction. On that note, DMM is taking on an expanded role in monitoring and reporting. There have been special monthly reports, which we started publishing in September. I think the first report is covering July and August. And then there's additional information in quarterly reports. We continue to work with stakeholders and the California ISO on developing new reports and metrics and analysis. The goal really is to provide a standardized set of metrics for all BAs in the CAISO and to provide the underlying data to market participants. That data, again, is posted, for now, is posted monthly on DMM's website. We do encourage you to download it, and if you have any questions or you find something anomalous, please do reach out and let us know. The email address to use for that is dmm@caiso.com. We are also providing enhanced informational reporting to the EIM governing body, and we will be doing that later this week. Again, I'd encourage you to read the reports. We've hosted a few calls on our EIM resource efficiency test reporting, and I believe the recordings of those are also available online if you're interested. So I will highlight one new chart from our set of these that's included in the report. This is a change, and I wanted to highlight it because it's really, I think, a poster child for how this process should work. And a market participant reached out with a question, asked us to change the way we were reporting this particular metric, and so we did. And I think it's to the benefit of all, really. This chart is now showing the incremental import limit amount. So that's showing the amount above base transfers that is available following a test failure. On the left-hand side is shown the percent of test failures with that incremental limit value. And on the right is showing the number of 15-minute intervals. That's what's represented by the dash. They're sorted by frequency. One of the things that really stands out on this chart is the relatively high value of CAISO incremental import limits following test failures. Otherwise, in the majority of areas, these are either 0 or between 0 and 250 megawatts. With that, I will stop again for questions before getting into some of the most exciting new material in the report. Just for a minute. This chart is mostly the same content that was presented in some of the ISO's monthly reports. Just to highlight, the ISO made a large number of market changes leading into the summer. Those were implemented not all at once, but across the summer. The latest implemented on changes to the market implemented on August 4th, and some new displays implemented on August 17th. Again, as we stated at the beginning of this presentation, we didn't see the same kind of region-wide high demand that was seen in 2020. So the impact of these has not been as thoroughly tested. One of the changes that we saw that has had, I think, a fairly significant impact was actually made in September of 2020. What that change did is limit the volume of exports clearing the day-ahead market, limit the quantity of those cleared day-ahead market exports passed from the day-ahead market into the real-time market at a very high priority level to the quantity that is supportable within the residual unit commitment process. This chart is showing the self-scheduled exports, so PT exports in red that cleared the day-ahead market and cleared RUC in bold, and in the light is showing the ones that in fact cleared the day-ahead market but didn't clear RUC. Similarly, the yellow, the bold, is showing the self-schedules, so the not backed by non-RA resources. It's a double negative. LPT, slightly lower self-scheduled exports, and then in the sort of faded color, those that did not pass out of the residual unit commitment, were not physically supportable, and then in green is showing economic exports. Cleared and then dropped in RUC. On most of these days, and this chart is showing the real-time version, so it's the same days and the same peak hours for the last chart. What we see in red are those cleared day-ahead exports that were also cleared in RUC and then cleared in real-time. What we see in yellow are real-time self-schedules that in fact clear the real-time market. And we see in the faded color some that in fact did not clear the real-time market. Green again is economic. So a highlight of this story is that although the September 2020 changes were limiting the exports passed from the residual unit commitment process to the real-time market, to those physically supported, some of those dropped at that point, were rebid into the market, and in fact did clear to serve load in other areas. There were a number of market changes that had to do with the treatment of high priority exports and wheels, particularly under the August 4th tariff changes. Exports clearing both the day-ahead and residual unit commitment process could be curtailed before internal load in the real-time market. And exports are now required to demonstrate support from non-resource adequacy capacity to have equal priority with native load if curtailment is necessary. Thus far, following those changes implemented on August 4th, there has been no curtailment necessary. Also, under those August 4th tariff changes, wheeling transactions were required to register 45 days in advance of the month and to demonstrate both a firm power supply contract to serve load of an external load-serving entity and monthly firm transmission to the CAISO border to qualify for prioritization equal to or above native load. And again, thus far, no curtailment has been necessary. We took a look at the high priority wheels which were registered. There was over 1,000 megawatts of high priority wheels registered for August, a little below 700 megawatts registered for September. On most days, and this is looking at the peak on those, sort of the peak of the bids on those days, there were very few high priority wheels actually scheduled in the market. Those are shown in yellow and in orange below. That said, so those are the highest priority wheels. We did see a market increase in wheeled energy, particularly compared to the summer of 2020. This chart is showing the volume of imports above the x-axis and the export leg of wheels bid into the market in the peak hours, so hours 17 to 21 between June and September. Here we're showing them by where the import leg is entering the CAISO and where the export leg is leaving. Really, most of that power is outside of the CAISO system is moving from the northwest of the areas of the WEC to the southwest areas of the WEC. About a third is entering north of path 26 in the ISO and exiting south. About 2/3 is entering south of path 26, so not using that internal congestion, not creating internal congestion, and then again exiting south of path 26. I won't go through this chart in too much gory detail, but I will say what we're seeing is that about a third of the wheels that were bid into the market this summer were coming across the Malin in the north, and about 2/3 were coming in directly south of path 26. So on knob. This is my last slide. I'll cover a couple things on this slide, and then would definitely be happy to take any questions at all. This chart is showing real-time and day-ahead availability of resource adequacy resources in the ISO. Here we're showing average performance based on the top 200 hours. That's based on the most restrictive MCC bucket from the CAISO. These figures, a couple things to highlight. I know it's a lot of numbers on the page. Couple things to highlight here. One, performance was very similar to the performance in the top 220 hours last year in 2020. Two, couple changes. We're seeing more resource adequacy being provided by use-limited resources than we did in 2020. And we're particularly seeing an increase in the resource adequacy generation provided by storage. Overall, another note I'll make here is that the demand response capacity shown on this slide is not from the utility programs, which provide the bulk of demand response capacity. This is from the third-party demand response. We're measuring performance here as not on outage, and those resource adequacy resources that are actually bid or self-scheduled into the market. So again, on average, we end up with about 88% that are self-scheduled in the market. The report also contains coverage of the ISO's CPM. There was a significant event CPM request for backstop capacity, and the cost of that to the market was a little under $10 million for the quarter. And that is my last slide. I'll stop for any questions at all. not hearing any questions on the phone. Thank you so much for your time today. Very much appreciate it. I know there are a lot of competing priorities this time of year. If you do have any other questions or you're listening to the recording of this later and have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to the Department of Market Monitoring and ask. We look forward to hearing from you.